We all know someone who's just a little bit too confident in their ability to be the best gamer they can be. Someone who is genuinely incapable of accepting any fault in any death that they have in any game. Obviously, just blaming it on the inputs or a laggy system. Thing is, they think they're so great, but they've actually got a few things helping them out. As have I, as have the rest of us. Though these are things that are quite subtle and we don't often acknowledge, there's actually a bunch of ways that developers help us out in playing their games. So maybe our abilities aren't quite as good as we think they are. I'm Amy from WhatCulture, and here are 10 ways you're worse at video games than you think. 10. Enemies miss you on purpose? As the capabilities of consoles have continued to defy expectations and push boundaries, the line between a genuine gaming title and a Hollywood blockbuster has begun to blur. Games like Uncharted are some of the best examples of this, with their jaw-dropping visuals and incredible spectacles paired with death-defying all-action sequences. However, whilst players are living their best lives and marvelling at their impressive stunt work, they might overlook just how many times they should have been killed by their enemies. Stormtrooper aim is one of the most memed parts of the film industry, with enemies missing easy shots at shameful rates, but it still remains just as prevalent in the gaming industry too. Developers in franchises like Uncharted often purposefully program their AI enemies to miss their first couple of shots on a player in order to ramp up the adrenaline, force them into cover, and present a more cinematic shootout experience. I mean, there's nothing cinematic about being headshot immediately. Other games design enemies to approach more slowly, allowing time for players to take up a position and adjust, whilst some even lower the accuracy of their enemies the closer the player might get. You may think you're an absolute hotshot and a master at dodging enemy fire, but the chances are that the enemies were never going to hit you in the first place. 9. Smart steering. Is there a better way of dismantling family and friendship ties than a racing game? If there is, I'm yet to find it. Titles like Mario Kart and all its subpar competitors have this strange ability to present themselves as light-hearted party games whilst also being able to cause some of the most infuriating, fracturing experiences imaginable. Being able to pride yourself on being the best at a driving game like Mario Kart is therefore quite a good boast. But as these series have moved on, so have the number of things going on in the background helping players out in more clutch moments. Whilst classic titles like the original Super Mario Kart are filled with features actively working against the player, more and more releases have come jam-packed with tools to help them out at every twist and turn. Smart steering is one of the biggest ones, a subtle control feature that will ensure a player will always hold a consistent racing line and not fall off any ledges or into any obstacles. And the feature generally works quite well too, with players being forgiven for not realising it's in play, but it's fair to say that it definitely changes the dynamic and gives you a very unfair advantage over any other fellow players who might not be using it. 8. Nerfing off-screen enemies. We've all seen it, a main character being swarmed by an entire army of enemies who subsequently only attack one at a time instead of the far more logical option of just overwhelming you all at once. But what players might not know is that there are even a few development tricks going on in these sequences behind the scenes that are helping them out even further. In certain games, there have been instances where developers have used the camera to nerf off-screen and far away enemies rendering in the distance. These nerfs are often placed on an enemy's movement, slowing them down so that players are able to adjust in an effort to find the sweet spot for an experience that's adrenaline pumping without being overwhelming. So the next time you're mowing through a whole army of baddies and escaping with just a few slivers of health left, just remember the game's developers are holding your hand slightly with a couple of subtle tweaks. 7. Hitscan. On the whole, first-person shooters offer a more direct and immersive experience compared to a third-person alternative, so it's unsurprising that so many gamers feel like Rambo incarnate when they're flying through levels causing carnage. Hitscan is one of the most important programming tools ever introduced to the world of gaming, casting a line from a weapon to determine whether a shot hits an object or a character or not. Unlike in real life, Hitscan registers a hit instantly, rather than taking the time in the air into account, meaning that players are free to fire away at their targets and not worry about things like the opponent's movement or something more trivial like wind. Hitscan ensures that players don't need a decade's experience in weaponry and ballistics to get on with a shooter title, and makes the whole cause and effect of pressing a button to fire a gun and registering a shot a much simpler experience. There's still plenty of skill required to be a master at shooter titles, no doubt, but just remember there are still plenty of ways developers could make these games much more demanding. 6. Coyote Spaces. As video games have navigated their way to the top of the entertainment industry, platformers such as Super Mario, Sonic the Hedgehog, and Crash Bandicoot have all become some of the most popular titles going. Every self-respecting gamer has completed at least one platformer in their life. But what most of these players don't realise is that there's actually a clever development trick going on behind the scenes helping to make things easier. Named after the famous Roadrunner chasing Looney Tunes character, who was often found defying gravity off the edge of a cliff, Coyote Space is a tool developers use to give players a more generous window when it comes to the space and time when making and landing jumps. The feature is entirely invisible, and most gamers probably don't even acknowledge its existence. However, there's no denying the impact it has on saving lives. Games without Coyote Space were often criticised as being too hard and not fun back in the day, which led to more and more developers implementing it in their more popular releases, to the point where it's an industry staple to this day. 5. Dynamic difficulty. Dynamic difficulty has been at the base of so many gaming conspiracy theories over the years, but its existence and impact is certainly becoming more and more prevalent. Whilst it obviously comes in many forms depending on the game, dynamic difficulty has become synonymous with real-world sports simulators, namely EA's FIFA and the Madden series. Terms like scripting have become the go-to excuses for players as a way of blaming their losses on anything but themselves. But just as the game's dynamic difficulty can make things harder for a player, it can also come to their aid. Everything from the speed in which opposition players move, to the likelihood of a goalkeeper making a save, to the luck they have in finding a successful pass to one of their teammates is regulated. The next time someone congratulates themselves on pulling themselves out of a rut and pulling off something perfect, they should be mindful of how the game's gods are giving them a helping hand. 4. Button placement. Have you ever stopped to actually think about how much thought goes into designing a video game controller? Aside from the overall comfort level, a lot of other thought goes into choosing where buttons are placed and what role each of them has to play in a game. For example, Nintendo allegedly went through up to 30 different prototypes when designing the wheel that came bundled with the Mario Kart Wii. 30 prototypes. For a wheel. That could be considered an extreme example, but it does do a good job in raising the point that there's a lot of facets that come into play for companies when designing their controllers. Whilst such a move would draw huge criticism from the community and most likely impact sales, imagine if one of your favourite video game developers suddenly decided to switch the jump button from X to O on a PlayStation controller. It would force so many gamers to consciously reconsider reflexes that have become second nature over the years, and consequently make the game so much harder to master. So next time you're speedrunning through one of your favourite games, just take a moment to thank the consideration developers have for ease and comfort when it comes to controls. 3. Invincible Teammates. It's easy to lose yourself in the carnage of the battlefield. With so much going on around them, from entire sections being blown up to enemies rushing up to them, teammates often blur into the background and become just another detail in helping set the scene. We spoke earlier about the absurdity of players taking the reins as a one-man wrecking machine, taking down entire armies at one time. So perhaps in an effort to stem that, developers have taken to preserving teammates as invincible in certain stages and levels. This strategy can vary somewhat, from the hilarious sight of a teammate being peppered by attacks but continuing to look entirely unfazed, to the more pragmatic approach that usually features a teammate staggering or needing to be healed after a certain amount of hits. A useful tool in helping players through levels or just to keep the story going with the guaranteed survival of a key character, this is just another example of how developers sometimes go out their way to say that they don't trust players to simply do the job themselves. 2. Health bars that never actually empty. Health bars have been a staple of gaming for almost as long as there have been titles worth selling. The universal symbol of how much health a player has in reserve, health bars can often be upgraded as a reward for further progression in the game. But there can also sometimes be a strange feature where players are given health bars that are nigh on impossible to fully empty. Take a series like Ubisoft's Assassin's Creed. In the series, a player's health bar is displayed across the top right-hand side of the screen, either via small blocks or bars, with a player dying if their bar empties. However, actually managing to empty the health bar has been made much harder for players than they might think. The majority of weapons in the series will need to hit a player 3 or 4 times before they drop a bar completely, and even when players are on their last legs, one of their bars will always fill up again so long as they aren't being hit. The next time someone boasts about never dying in games like these, just keep in mind that the health bar is definitely doing them a few favours. 1. Ignoring your inputs. Bemoaning either pressing or not pressing a button is one of the most used excuses in the book when it comes to gaming, and I'd know because I definitely do it myself. But what most gamers probably don't realise is that developers are often going out of their way to help you out. Third-person games generally follow the same sorts of control schemes. However, what some people may be surprised to learn is that developers sometimes put in a feature that will ignore some of their inputs. Known as thumbstick correction, the feature is designed to be almost a fail-safe against players making silly errors such as walking off ledges, and create a smoother playing experience with characters avoiding getting stuck in or around obstacles. It's one of those parts of the gaming experience that's so often overlooked when players are locked in on autopilot, but it's one that would be really frustrating and potentially game-breaking should it suddenly not be there anymore. So next time you're roaming around performing another big blockbuster move, just remember that there's a very useful helping hand guiding you along from behind the scenes. And with that, we've reached the end of this list of 10 ways you're worse at video games than you think. Do you know of any more little tricks that developers use to help guide you along? We'd love to read about them in the comments down below. And in the meantime, remember to check out WhatCulture.com for more lists and articles like this every single day. As always, I've been Amy from WhatCulture, and I'll catch you next time.